Hello, welcome to the PowerPoint module for the week of November 9th. And this is actually our last PowerPoint module for the semester. This week we're going to talk about some solutions. Now, we spent a lot of time this semester talking about issues, and while we've talked generally about solutions, this week we're going to get a little bit more specific about what we mean by solutions, and of course we're going to be limited to just a few examples because we're covering this in 1 week. But I do hope that this week does serve as a kind of wrap-up of the course and a way of really thinking about what we can do as individuals in order to promote social equity. Here are your objectives for this week. We're going to consider solutions to reduce the extent of social inequality in the US, again, using some specific examples. We're going to consider examples of what we'll call little r reform and big R reform, and that will make sense as we go through the module, I hope. And then discuss what we can do as individuals, as I said before, to promote social equity. I expect that this will take about an hour, maybe a little bit less time. Again, this is your final module for the semester. So this is the last of the material that we're going to cover, and then including what we do in class this week. Here are your deliverables for the week. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday night. You have your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and you don't have any assignments due this Friday. Now that said, if there is an assignment that you want to turn in to me and you have not yet turned it in, please reach out to me first, but I see no reason why I would not accept an assignment that's a bit late, okay? So if there are any assignments that you want to turn in that you have not yet turned in, please reach out to me and let's set up a plan for getting those assignments turned in, okay? But for the class overall, there are no assignments this Friday. Here's your opening question for this week. This is actually 3 or 4 questions wrapped into one, so I apologize for that. But I do want to start by posing a question to you that's about one of your readings. So here it is. According to Jackson, and we need to have a second conversation, so that's the reading from the reader. What is conversation 1? So she distinguishes between conversation 1 and conversation 2. So I'm asking, what is conversation 1? What are some examples of interventions that fit within conversation 1? And there are some embedded in the text, so you can just find those. Why do you think conversation 1 predominates discussions about social inequality and policy interventions, right? So a bit of your own reflection there as well. Okay, so I know it's 3 questions, but a lot of this is simply recalling or looking up within the text. And I think this is important setup for the discussion we're going to have moving forward. So you can pause here, answer this opening question, and then come back for the remainder of the module. So this is really a response to the opening question that I'm providing for you, but hopefully you've already answered the question. And this is just an opportunity to review or to think about this a bit further. So in the reading, we need to have a second conversation. We've got conversation 1 and conversation 2. And these conversations are about essentially what we do, not just as individuals, but societally, what we do to address social inequality. Okay, what are our possible interventions and which ones should we really be focusing on? And that's where these 2 conversations come into play. So conversation 1 is what we're going to call little r reform. So little r meaning we're really making tweaks to existing systems. We're making some very narrow solutions, something very specific to tightly defined problems as described in the reading. So this means that we're thinking about small change. Maybe we're trying to change individual behaviors or individual choices. We might use something called nudge philosophy in order to do that. We might try to nudge people to say, for public health folks in this class, we might nudge people to make healthier food choices, or we might nudge people to engage in physical activity by providing some kind of health education, right? Or, as described in the reading, nudge philosophy would apply to an intervention that involves, putting healthier foods at eye level in the grocery store. Very small change. And possibly we get some pretty substantial difference in outcomes out of this, but typically what we see is, small change leads to maybe some small difference in outcomes. And it is very individually focused. We're focused on changing behaviors. We're focused on changing the way people make choices. This is conversation one, and this is where most of the conversation lies when we talk about interventions to promote greater equality or equity, making these little changes, in part because this is easier, right? In a political system that really does restrict revolutionary change or limit opportunities for revolutionary change, we see these little changes happen more often. They're not as controversial. They're easier to implement. They're cheaper, right? So conversation one is where we are most of the time. Now, Jackson is arguing that we need to move on to conversation two, and we need to have this conversation at least in addition to conversation one, right? We're going to call conversation two Big R reform, right? So focusing on institutions rather than on individual behavior. So the focus of Big R reform or conversation two isn't just to make these little incremental changes, but instead to fundamentally change the ways in which social institutions are structured, right? So the images on the right side, the Band-Aid we might consider to be a kind of metaphor for conversation one. We're putting a bandage on a much bigger social issue or a much bigger social inequity. And the Band-Aid, obviously in this picture, it looks like there's some foundational trouble with a building. And putting that Band-Aid on there isn't going to solve the problem, right? In fact, it might do very little. But if we fundamentally rebuild the way our institutions work and the way that they are structured, and I know this is still conceptual, but bear with me. If we fundamentally change systems, then this is big R reform, right? And this is the conversation we aren't having enough of, according to Jackson. We need to have more conversations about big change. And it's understandable why we don't have these conversations as much, because big change is also harder, right? It's more expensive. It takes more convincing. But I do want to talk this week about the ways in which big change can happen and the ways in which it has happened, right? As an example or examples to go by when thinking about what is possible, right? We're going to get into some examples next. I know that this has been more conceptual so far, but we're going to get more specific, okay? So to lead us into an example here, and this is an example you're going to watch a video about in a moment, but I want to introduce it first. We can think about education through the lens of this little r reform and big R reform, and what we've seen and what we could see in fixing our education system in the US. So let's set this up a bit. Public school districts in the US, if we look at the quality of these school districts and these school systems, we see huge disparities in the quality of US public education. We've talked about this at various points throughout the semester, the kinds of disparities that we see in the quality of the buildings themselves, in the quality of the education and teacher training, in the curriculum, in the school supplies. I mean, we can think about a number of ways in which school systems differ in quality. And the question becomes, well, what do we do about this? And in order to best answer that, we have to think about how we got here. So what is our current funding system like in the US? Now, it's complicated, so I'm simplifying it here because we have states that have different types of funding policies, different funding structures. But overall, this is the kind of funding structure that we see, okay? And this is going to lead into talking about solutions in a moment. So in US schools or in US school districts, typically about 10% of funding that goes towards school systems or districts comes from the federal government. So various forms of federal support, whether these are grants, whether these are just standard federal dollars that are distributed across the country to school districts. About 10%. So the minority of funds come from the federal government. Most funding comes from the state and comes from local government. State funding varies substantially from state to state, how they organize it, how they distribute it, but we're going to focus more on local funding because this is actually where we see the most variation. Some schools have significantly more funding than others at the local level. And by local, I mean at the level of the city or the county or whatever municipality we're talking about. Could be a county, could be a city, probably, or a township. So local funding is the most variable, and here's why. Local funding depends on local property tax. So real estate tax, the tax that is paid on homes for homeowners. Local property value, so the value of homes, therefore is going to fundamentally shape the amount of school funding that districts receive. So for example, if we compare two houses, we have one house that has a value of $400,000 and we have another house with a value of $100,000. Even if they're taxed at the same rate in a given year, the $400,000 house in absolute dollars is going to contribute a lot more in tax to the locality than the $100,000 house. And then we see clusters of neighborhoods, townships, parts of townships that have much higher property values than neighboring areas. And so those places that have these clusters of really high value homes are putting a lot more absolute dollars into their schools than those with places that have homes of lower value or places where people primarily rent their homes instead of own them. So this is one of the big ways in which we see differences in the funding of our school districts. The other thing to consider is the extent of residential segregation, not just by income, but also by race. And so we see racial segregation across neighborhoods, which leads to racial segregation across school districts. And school districts that have predominantly Black or Hispanic students typically have significantly lower school funding per student than those with predominantly white students. All right, so that's just to give you a bit of a structural background in the US educational system. There's a lot more we could say here, but I wanted to say this first because I think it will help you in critically thinking about the video that you're about to watch and what could be done in order to resolve the inequities that we see. Okay, so we're going to go on to the video question next. So here's your video question, and this is expanding on that example of education and thinking about big R reform as opposed to little r reform. So here's your question. So I want you to watch a video clip. The link is on Inquire. It's titled How Black High School Students Are Hurt by Modern Day Segregation. Once you watch that, answer the following video question. What big R reform would you propose to close educational gaps across schools in the video? Why do you think this reform has not yet been implemented? Okay, so you can pause here, watch that video, answer this question, and then come back for the last few slides. So I want to switch gears for these last few slides. We've been so far talking about, and you've been writing about, this idea of big R reform, right? And making changes to policy and making changes to institutional structures. Now, as individuals, we of course can speak about the ways in which these structures are unequal and the ways in which they promote and continue the inequalities that we see. But I do want to end considering the ways in which we as individuals can act and what we really can do individually to promote equity. because we're not all going to be policymakers, right? We're not all going to be focusing on institutional change in our work lives, for example. But we can all, through our interactions, through our daily decisions, we can make a difference. And I do want to give you that bit of hope in this course, in closing this course especially. Okay, so in order to talk about what we can do, we first need to talk about the way or where we are nestled within social systems and social structures, right? We have talked about privilege in this class, but we haven't really had readings that explicitly discussed it until now. We could have started with this reading, Power, Privilege, Difference in Us, at the very beginning of the semester, or we could end with it. And so I chose to end with it. Before we get into what we can do as individuals, what is privilege? So according to the reading, privilege is having access to paths of least resistance within social structures. And he talks quite a bit about these paths of least resistance, right? And some of us have access to these paths and some of us do not. And often when we do have access to those paths, we take them because they're easier. And it's easier than attempting to act against a system that already exists, right? Now, other ways of framing privilege and talking about privilege. Privilege is the accumulation of unearned advantages, right? So I was born with a certain set of advantages. We talked about this with intersectionality, right? So for example, if I use myself, my whiteness, that advantages me. That is a privilege. I could also talk about my class background as being an element of my privilege. And of course, I also have intersectional identities that maybe don't provide me with the same privilege. Gender or sexuality, these are intersecting identities that confer different amounts of, say, privilege or oppression. But we do all have to acknowledge that we all have some amount of privilege. The fact that you are all here in college means that you are living at least with some level of privilege. And we need to understand that before we can understand really what we as individuals can do in order to promote equity, right? The last thing I have on this slide is the idea that advantages that we have through our privilege are conferred systematically within and across social institutions, meaning that we all exist within a social system, and based on our social identities, we are positioned to either have more advantages or more disadvantages. We talked about this with intersectionality, so I don't think I have to get into it too much. One other important thing to take away from privilege as a concept is we're not saying that everybody's lives, like someone who has privilege, not that their life is easy necessarily, right? No, we all face individual hardships. We're not saying that people with privilege have easy lives. We're saying that people with privilege, we all have some of it, right? But privilege does enable the easier movement through institutions. It enables making decisions with fewer barriers, right? So with that background, now we're going to start to do it here, but in class, we're also going to talk about what we do with privilege and what it has to do with individual action to promote equity. Okay, so that's the next couple slides, and we will talk more about this in class as well. Now, with that understanding of privilege, what is our responsibility? That is, how do we take privilege and use it to empower others? And that really is our responsibility. So this is a quote right out of the reading, Power, Privilege, Difference in Us. So that's the Alan Johnson reading. And this is the very last paragraph. All right, so I'm going to read it. But I do want you to think as we go through this passage together. I want you to think about what this means for your own action, your own responsibility. Here it is. As long as we participate in social systems, we don't get to choose whether to be involved in the consequences they produce. We're involved simply through the fact that we're here. As such, we can only choose how to be involved, whether to be just a part of the problem or also to be a part of the solution. That's where our power lies, and also our responsibility. Okay? So he's saying here that we all participate in social systems that provide privilege to some and oppress others. The example in the reading was um, the clothing that we own. When we talk about global inequality, I don't know about you, but most of the clothing in my closet was not made in the US. It was made in lower income countries that exploit, typically women, for very low wage labor in order to produce those articles of clothing that I wear. And so, in a sense, I am, and we all are, a part of a social system that oppresses some for the benefit of others. And what do we do about that? There are lots of decisions that we as individuals can make, even if we are part of these social systems. By acting within them, we are able to make some difference. I'm going to, or you're about to answer a closing question that elaborates on that. So I'm going to stop there because I want you to think about examples in your own lives. But this is something we're going to talk about when we get to class, okay? So let's move on to our last question, and then that's the end of your PowerPoint modules for the semester. Here's your closing question. This is more of an opportunity to self-reflect and share what you're comfortable with sharing. What paths of least resistance have you taken? And that can be something very specific, it can be something recent, or it can be something more general, right? Why do you think you have taken these paths? And then what alternative paths exist for you to take in the future? Okay, so this is an opportunity for you to reflect on really how privilege shapes what you do, and also alternatives that enable you to use privilege to empower others, okay? So you can pause here, answer this closing question, and then there's just the final slide with what we're doing in class for the week, all right? So for class this week, as usual, we're gonna have our in-class group meeting on Wednesday, our Zoom group meeting on Friday. We're gonna wrap up the course. We're gonna talk about some key takeaways, and we're really just gonna have a final chance to talk about what's happening in terms of current events, and also to consider how all of this relates to the course. All right, so please do come prepared to discuss, and I look forward to seeing all of you for our final week of class. Again, this is your last PowerPoint module, so I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.